Okay, for this evening we continue our discussion on different events in the life of the Buddha, the key events in the life of the Buddha, and taking perhaps a somewhat different approach to how it normally is taken. And so what we're trying to do is just focus on some of the key issues and really sort of dig into what's going on in some of these things. So the next event we've talked about so far the Buddha's birth. We've talked about the Buddha's upbringing, his luxurious upbringing, and we've talked about the moment when he sat down under the rose apple tree and went into first jhana when he was a child. So these are some of the key events of his life, and we don't actually know a huge amount beyond these things. In fact, in terms of narrative, in the early suttas, we don't actually hear anything about the Buddha's family or family life. We know that the Buddha had a son, and you can come closer if you like. We know that the Buddha had a son, and we know he was married, but we don't really know much about. There are some stories about like events when the Buddha encountered his son and his former wife after he was enlightened, but there's no stories about talking about his family life before his enlightenment, which is curious. But anyway, I don't really know why that's the case. Anyway, so where we come to next is in terms of the things that the Buddha actually mentioned is the going forth. And so this is the key moment in the Buddha's personal story, and in a way the key moment of the story of Buddhism. Now, there's a few different versions of this event in the suttas, told in a few different ways. So the first passage I'll read is from Majjhima Nikaya number 36, the Mahasaccaka Sutta, and in fact this is the same sutta we read from the other day. It includes also the account of where the Buddha went into first jhana. But prior to that, in the sutta, the Buddha is asked about whether he's in a discussion with this ascetic called Saccaka, where we don't need to go into it, but it's a discussion about pleasant and painful feeling. We'll maybe talk more about it later on. But the question the Buddha is asked is, surely you must have had feelings so pleasant or so painful that they could occupy your mind. How could I not, Agivesana? Before my awakening, when I was still unawakened but intent on awakening, I thought, living in a house is cramped and dirty, but the life of one gone forth is wide open. It's not easy for someone living at home to live the spiritual life utterly full and pure, like a polished shell. Why don't I shave off my hair and beard, dress in ochre robes, and go forth from the lay life to homelessness? Some time later, while still black-haired, blessed with youth in the prime of life, though my mother and father wished otherwise, weeping with tearful faces, I shaved off my hair and beard, dressed in ochre robes, and went forth from the lay life to homelessness. So it's a very brief account, just gives you the overall details, but it does give you some interesting things. So first of all, the Buddha's reflection about the difference between the home life, cramped and dirty, but the life gone forth is wide open. Right? And I think this is an interesting perspective. One time I was I had this conversation once with a young Thai monk. He was a young guy who'd come along to ordain, and like a lot of these young Thai monks, I don't necessarily know that much about Buddhism or Dhamma or something like that, but they have this kind of aspiration to become a monk. And it seemed he'd sort of come from, I guess, quite a bit of a wild background. And he said he likes being a monk because it's a cage. It's like it's a cage. He's like he's locked up and he can't do anything, and that stops him from doing anything bad, right? And that's his perspective on being a monk. I was like, okay, fair enough. And but you see, the Buddhist perspective actually is quite different. So the Buddhist perspective is that the household life is cramped and tied up with attachments, and the life gone forth is wide open. And there is something really beautiful about that, and there's something about a freedom of the life gone forth. And, you know, it's something that we still kind of, it's in our DNA as monastics. Like we're kind of wanderers, and we're free spirits. We don't like to be tied down to a particular place or something like that. And there's this kind of thing in my mind. I still feel kind of very free when I don't have anything there. Like a number of years ago, and I was traveling back to Sydney from somewhere, and there'd been some miscommunication, and I arrived in the airport, and there was no one there to pick me up at the airport. And I was waiting there for a while. It seemed no one was coming. And I didn't have a phone or whatever. So anyway, I just thought, oh, that's good. I'll just walk. And so I just walked out of the airport and walked down the road. I felt so good. I felt, my God, I feel so happy. Just to have no expectations and just walk down the road. And it just felt so wonderful. And so for me, that experience as a monk is just such a beautiful thing. And it's interesting that after doing this reflection about the life gone forth being wide open, that the Buddha or the Bodhisattva then went forth even though his mother and father wept with tears running down their faces. And of course this is something that is still very current and very meaningful in cultures whenever anybody wants to go forth. And I know a number of people, especially young men and women from a Chinese cultural background. It seems to be particularly strong, that there's a lot of expectations to fulfill the family duties and to live up to what the parents' expectations are. And, sometimes people have told me that if they just want to become a monk or become a nun, but they feel like if they did that their parents would die. My mother would die if I did this, like literally. That's how they feel. And they say, how do you do this? How do you go forth? And if you want to ordain? And I said, well, it's easy actually. First of all, you just have to grow your hair long and join a rock and roll band. Then your parents will be so thrilled if you do like literally anything else. Yes, please ordain. Yes, that would be great. So one of the interesting things about being a monk is that how many people say to you, sort of apropos of nothing, that, I could never be a monk. I'm like, well, I wasn't actually asking whether you wanted to be one. My stepfather said this to me once. He's a sort of 80-year-old Englishman, and he said, I could never be a monk. I'm like, yes, you're probably right. But there's something about it that's like a calling, right? It's something about it that sends a message. And I think that's really powerful. And the fact that we still wear our robes is very powerful. When we're in Perth, from the monastery there, we would go and visit. There's a Catholic monastery, a Benedictine monastery, and a monks community there. And usually, we sort of got to know them and would go and visit each other. And one of the things that they told us after we'd been there going there a couple of years, that they said that because they still wore their traditional robes in the monastery, but they said that when they're out of the monastery, that they normally had sort of changed into civvies, so they're just wearing ordinary clothes out on the street. And they said, having met the Buddhist monks, they then had the courage to just wear their proper robes out in the street. So they gave them the courage to do that. And I think it's really important, and it's one of the reasons why we still do our arms round practice. And when I'm in Sydney, we go for arms round every day, and we just collect food from people in our neighbourhood. And a lot of people aren't Buddhists. We get fed literally every day. We get a lot of food from the Muslim groceries and shops down there. We get a lot of food from like the Hindu shops and restaurants and places like that, as well, of course, as the Buddhist community. And it was funny. We went down there once with, we'd go with my friend Venerable Akaliko and one of his friends from Sydney, and he's a sort of, not really interested in Buddhism and just a kind of typical, I guess, secularized Western young guy. And we're going around, and he just couldn't comprehend it. He said, like, how can Muslims be giving you food? How can Hindu, aren't they the opposition? And so this conception that people have in this secular world is that religions are always at each other's throats. And we're like, yeah, actually, no, it's really not like that. And actually we get a lot of encouragement and support from the local Muslim community. We went to, go to the Ramadan dinner and had to apologize to them and say, oh, I'm sorry, we'll just have some tea. Nothing about the quality of the food or anything. It's just our vows. And but there's something about seeing that, and when people see that. And one time I was at one event and was driven home by one of the Muslim people from that event, and he was talking about his lifetime. He was asking me about the monk's lifestyle, and I was just saying some of the simple things that we did, that we went for alms and, we just owned one set of robes and things like this. And he's like, oh, that's so powerful. He said that we don't have anything like that. And so this kind of symbol still means something. It still matters. If I go back, if I think of what my first image of Buddhism is, my earliest image that I can recall of anything to do with Buddhism is just like just a half memory in my mind of a time when I must have been about maybe 10 or 12, and it was a show on television on the ABC, the national broadcaster in Australia, and it must have been a documentary, and in the documentary was a Western Buddhist nun. And I'm guessing she must have been in the Tibetan tradition. And I know subsequently I learnt that there were a few Australian women who ordained as nuns in that time. So this would have been the late 1970s. And I just have this image in my mind of this woman with this shaven head and talking about her spiritual life and her spiritual path. And it was so weird and so inexplicable, it's like a voice from another world. How can this? What is this person doing? How can they be living that life? What is this? And I was just a kid. I didn't really understand any of these things, but something about it stuck with me, and something about it mattered to me, and something about it created this kind of image in my mind of something that maybe we can make a different choice. And so that choice to leave home is always a choice which is fraught. It's always a choice which has tension, and you can see that's what's mentioned here, that the mother and father weeping with tears running down their faces. Actually, of course, in most of the times when the Buddha's life story is told, the main tension is between leaving the wife and the son, and that's not mentioned here, but in any case, the idea is similar, that there is this juxtaposition of, on the one hand, the love and the concern and the care for one's family and the knowing. The Buddha's not making any excuses here, right? He's not saying, oh yeah, my mum and dad were so happy for me to go forth, right? Yeah, it was a really hard thing to do, and that tension, that it's like an irreconcilable force pulling both ways. And this is something which lies at the heart of the Buddhist community and the heart of the Buddhist ethics. How do we reconcile our concern for the world, for our family, for the people that we love, with our desire for freedom? And of course, as long as we're in this world, that doesn't go away. It doesn't go away just because you ordain, just in case you were wondering. right? I mean, it changes, the way you handle it changes, but it's still there. And, I still talk with my mum and talk with my sister and these kinds of things, and it's not that your attachments and love and so on just goes away, right? But what it does is it gives you a decisive orientation. It says, this is my commitment, this is my vocation. I'm going to read another story of renunciation, and this one is from another text, and this one gives a much less standard version. And this is a very interesting and quite curious little text called the Atta Danda Sutta. And again, for those wanting references, Sutta Nipata number 4.15 in the Attaka Wagga of the Sutta Nipata. And this is an interesting little sutta which is, I think, unfairly or unjustly neglected in discussions of the Buddha's life, and which even in the best reader's compilation of text on the Buddha's life is Bhikkhu Nyanamoli's Life of the Buddha, and even there this passage is omitted. So here's what it says, and I'll be translating on the fly here because I don't have a good translation to hand. Fear is born of the taking up of weapons. See all these people fighting each other. So this is the first thing, and that's already a very different perspective, isn't it? Right? He's not talking about how the life at home is cramped and dusty. He's talking about how people are fighting each other. Yeah, it's not attachment which is the issue here. It's war. It's hostility. Yeah? And presumably this must come out of a specific historical circumstance. We don't know much about the history of the Sakyan Republic at that time, but he must have witnessed fighting to be able to say this. Sangvegang Kitta Yasami, I'll speak to you of how I became inspired as I experienced it. Having seen this generation, having seen people flopping about like fish in a dried up stream, everyone opposed to each other, when I saw that, this fear came upon me. That's a really powerful image, isn't it? Yeah? That's a really powerful image. He's not pulling any punches here. Yeah? Yeah? People, human beings, are like fish flopping around in a dried up stream. The whole world is empty. The whole world lacks an essence. And all of the directions, each direction is tossed about. Seeking a home for myself, I didn't see any place that was unoccupied. Yeah, I think it's really worth kind of letting these verses settle in, because each verse and each line is very powerful and very. To me, I love these verses so much because they come from just a really raw experience. Yeah? That idea that samanta masaro loko, the whole world lacks any kind of essence, lacks any kind of. There's nothing to get hold of in the world. Everything is being tossed around. And again, it seems like it must have come from an experience of like some kind of social turmoil during the young Siddhartha's upbringing. He couldn't find any place. And when he's saying he's looking for a place to stay and can't find anywhere that's unoccupied, obviously this is meant in a metaphorical sense, right? It's not just talking in a purely physical sense, but at the same time, it's a very striking kind of metaphor. You think of India at that time as being, relatively small population, vast forests. You'd think if you if you want a place to stay, there's plenty of places. And yet already he's feeling that everything is crowded, and everyone in the next verse is, when he saw everybody opposing each other, everybody fighting each other, then he became disillusioned. Disvame aratiyahu. Then he saw a dart, an arrow, which is stuck in the heart, very hard to see. And when struck by that arrow, people would flee or run around in every direction. Again, it's a very kind of vivid image. You think of like what it's like to see an animal in the forest, maybe a deer struck by an arrow, and see how it just panics and runs around every direction. But when that arrow is pulled out, then one neither runs nor does one sink down or collapse, perhaps. So this arrow that the Buddha is talking about, of course, is the arrow of craving. And this recognition that all of these problems, all of these hostilities, all of these this violence and unrest in the world ultimately is caused by what's in our own hearts. This is a very profound insight into the nature of suffering. And the Buddha's, remember, when he saw this, the Buddha was just going forth. He wasn't enlightened yet. But to me, this is very interesting because it shows that, like, the normal account of this, of the going forth, places the Buddha's inspiration firmly in terms of like a personal journey. Like one sees old age, sickness and death and realizes that he's also going to get old and die. But this is placing it in terms of a social and historical context. Yeah. And I don't think they're necessarily contradictory accounts, but this is giving a different account, a less archetypal, less universal account, a more personal, a more particular account. It speaks to me more about what his experience was. So if the world was crowded and tossed about and full of people opposing each other in those idyllic days of 2,500 years ago in India, imagine what it's like today. What is it like today? People with no home to go to, and as I've been saying throughout the retreat, my people in Australia now, no one has any idea. There are certainly many tens of thousands of people in Australia who are now homeless, stuck in highways in the middle of nowhere with fire just burning over the top of them. People shifted from one place to another to hide on a beach to get out of the flames and then try to go home, and then they have to go somewhere else because that's on fire as well. And it keeps going on. They say that it's going to be mid-40s this weekend. And for the Americans here, that's about 120 or so. No hope, no possibility of rain before the end of January. And of course, that's just a possibility. It might not rain for years. In some places in Australia, it hasn't rained for years. What are we to do? Yeah? There's no place you can call home. It's not just Australians. In Jakarta, there's now 30,000 people homeless from floods just yesterday. Can you imagine it? We just become so inured to this. 30,000 people, hundreds dead. What is this world that we're living in? Where are any of us going to find a home? And the Indonesian government just last year already started making plans to move Jakarta, to build a new capital city, because Jakarta is going to be underwater. There's more than 10 million people there. They won't have a home to live. Jakarta will be underwater, Mumbai, Bangkok, Yangon, Colombo, Singapore, Perth, all of South Vietnam. all of South Vietnam, all of the Mekong Delta, all of the Ganges Delta. These will all be underwater, 25% of Bangladesh. They'll be underwater not at some indefinable point in the future, by 2050, the latest projections. They'll be underwater, and there'll be how many people displaced? 100 million? 200 million? Those people won't have any home to go to. Where will they go to? Where is our home? For myself, I'm a professional homeless person. I made the choice, right? Now for me, I'm well aware that for me this is a very privileged choice. I grew up in a middle-class background in a wealthy society, and I always knew in the back of my mind if I wanted a home to go to, I could always find one, right? And for that reason, I didn't worry about it too much. I was quite happy. Just leave it all behind. And my life as a renunciant is supported by others. And I teach Dhamma, and I live as a monk, and I support communities and do various work for Dhamma and so on. And as a result of that, the Buddhist community sees fit to give me enough to have some robes to wear and some food to eat and a place to stay. And that's all I want, actually. And if you really ask me, what else do you want? I just don't want anything else. It's so little, right? But at the same time, it's a lot. And it's a lot more than a lot of people have. So we're not all going to make that choice to become homeless and to leave and to go and stay in the forest. Probably we shouldn't. I mean, certainly in Australia, the viability of building forest monasteries is seriously under question because of the bushfire danger. So if we're not going to go there, we're going to live at home. Again, what does that mean? I don't know, but I think we need to start questioning what it means to have a home. I mean, when we have a home, what does it mean? Well, basically what it means is that we get to close the door to people that we don't want there. Yeah? Ultimately, that's what it means. I get to have my space, I'm going to close the door, and you can't come in. If that's what I want. Right? And of course we have this sense of ownership. And look, everyone likes it. I love that. I love being able to close the door and saying to people, no, you can't come in. It's one of the happiest times of my day, right? And go to my room, close the door. No, that's it. Right? At the same time, we have to... Why do we get to do that? Why do we get to say that we have a sense of ownership over this piece of the earth? What are we going to do when there are hundreds of millions of people who don't have that home? Are we going to retain our sense of ownership? This is our land, our home, our room, our space, our country. You don't have a right to exist on the earth? Of course, many people already today who are in that situation. And one of the worst situations is the terrible plight of the Rohingya people. And the terrible genocide by the Burmese government, and fled to Bangladesh, and they're just surviving in Bangladesh, but the last proposal that they had was that they were going to house them on an island in the Andaman Sea. So these are islands that are going to be swallowed up by climate change in a decade or two. No thank you, they said. They don't have a home. There's no resolution in sight for them. And when we see this, we look at this and we look at this plight and we think that's terrible. We think what the Burmese government did is terrible. The fact that the Bangladeshi government doesn't really fully accept them, I mean, I can't I can't preach on that. I mean, Australia also has a terrible record with asylum seekers. At the same time, the fact that they have no home, they're exposed to all kinds of suffering. They get, even if they flee, they go on boats across the oceans, they get trapped and taken into slavery and all kinds of things. That's just terrible. And we look at this and we have so much pity and we have so much compassion and we think this is a terrible plight for people to be in. But what we don't think is, what's going to happen when they come to my door? What's going to happen when I go to someone else's door and knock on their door and say, my home just burnt down, my home just flooded, I don't have a place to stay. Please let me in. I just want a roof over my head. What are we going to do when that happens to us? And this planet, this earth that we live on, is so incredibly beautiful and incredibly bountiful and has given us so much. Yet, can't give us everything. It's not limitless. So what does it mean to talk about renunciation in this day and age? I first heard this addressed when I was in a conference in Vienna a number of years ago, and I went for this conference, and a Religions for Peace conference, and they had a workshop on climate change. And one of the fellows who was doing the workshop, who was speaking at that conference, I didn't know him at the time, and he said, we're going to have to face the necessity of nekkhamma. And he used the Pali word nekkhamma. And he said renunciation. And I said, he must be a Buddhist. And so this nekkhamma, leaving home, going forth, giving things up, traditionally in Buddhism, I mean, this is part of the Eightfold Path, right? But traditionally in Buddhism, it's mainly felt to be a monastic virtue. And, certainly in Thailand, the kind of dynamic is very much that the monks will give things up. So we can celebrate their renunciation by giving them lots of stuff, right? So it doesn't mean I have to give anything up. I can give lots of dana, and then I can celebrate their giving things up. But of course, there's much more to that. Renunciation is not just for monks and nuns. Renunciation is something for everyone in the sense of moderation. But it's something that we're going to have to consider much more deeply in the coming years, in the coming decades. And renunciation is not going to be something that we're going to have a choice about. We're going to have less. And we're going to not have those things that we take for granted now. And so our choice, especially as people who are conscious and spiritual practitioners, our choice is, how do we face that future? How do we understand our possessions, our places, our things in a world where so many people no longer have those things? Renunciation isn't a bad thing. Having less is not a bad thing. And if we do it deliberately and we do it by choice, then it's going to be a lot less painful than if we wait and hold on to everything until the bitter end, until it's ripped from our raw and bloody fingers. All of you here on this retreat have left your home. You've all come here. Even if you've come here with the whole family. This also has a tradition in Buddhism. In some of the Jataka stories, when the Bodhisattva renounces and goes forth, they don't just renounce by themselves, they go forth with the whole family. Mum and dad and the kids all go off into the forest and the Himalayas and practice and meditate. We have to stop defining ourselves in terms of our stuff, in terms of the size of the house that we have, in terms of the amount of things we've got in our wardrobe, in terms of the size of our paycheck. And what matters is not what we have, what matters is who we are, what matters is how we choose to live, what choices we make. While you're here, get used to it. Get used to the idea that you can give things up. What would happen if you're here on retreat and if your home got swept away while you were here? Imagine there was a flood or a fire. You're planning at the end of the retreat to go home, and then you get the call or get the message, your home doesn't exist anymore. That's the message that people have got this week, right? Tens of thousands of people. Your home just doesn't exist anymore. So what are we going to do then? Are we going to be like a fish flopping round in a dried up stream? Or are we going to make a choice that our life is not defined by our stuff? Our life is defined by our choices. And if we define our life by our choices and we learn to make choices that are in line with letting go, then we'll be ready for whatever the future has to throw at us. Okay, I'm going to finish up there. Let's finish by doing the closing chanting. Sangham